I want to welcome especially the brand new Consul General of Ecuador and his staff, Carlos Lenin House, who's here, just arrived a week ago, and some members of his staff as well. Really pleased and honored that you're here with us this morning. He's also brought with him a display about the oil disaster in Ecuador, and I would invite everybody to stop and take a look at it at some point during the day. It's something that we really need to be made aware of. So welcome. The format for this morning, we've been doing these World Catholicism Weeks for several years now, and the format that we've done in the past is 45-minute paper after 45-minute paper, and with question and answer after each one. But it gets a little exhausting, and we wanted to have more interaction. So this year we've asked our speakers to limit their spoken remarks to about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for conversation amongst the speakers. I might ask a few questions to get them talking and hopefully arguing and fighting amongst themselves. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion, and there should be ample time for that as well, at least a half hour for discussion amongst the whole audience and questions as well. So, and I will be introducing the speakers, not all at the beginning, but one by one as they approach the podium. We also have translation services as well, so if you want to ask questions of the Spanish-speaking people on the panel, then we've got facilities for that as well. We've got simultaneous translation going on as well. And one more preliminary remark. I just want to thank again Karen Kraft and Francis Salino, who do all the real work, and I just take the credit. So they are the heart and soul of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology. So thanks again to Karen and Francis, and if you have any problems, go see them, because they can fix it. They've got a magic wand and can fix it just like that. Our first speaker this morning is a good friend, both of me and the center, Emmanuel Katongole, who is with the Kroc Institute for Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He was formerly at Duke University, where he was the founding director of the Duke Divinity School's Center for Reconciliation. He's a Catholic priest from Uganda. He has a PhD from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. Leuven or Louvain? Which one was it? It was Leuven. It was. Okay, the Belgian one. That's right. And he's the author of many influential books, including The Sacrifice of Africa, which he wrote while he was with us here the last time, and he's now here with us for another 4 months this spring, working on another book that we all hope will be just as wonderful and influential as The Sacrifice of Africa was. If it's not, we want our money back. So no pressure. So please join me in welcoming Emmanuel Katongole.
Thank you, Bill, for the wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and a joy to be here this morning. And my paper or talk is on rooting God's mission in the African soil, a theological experiment. The ecological crisis constitutes indeed a definite and a unique kairos in our time. But as the South African theologians reminded us in 1985, the kairos is a time of judgment, but also a time of unique opportunity. That the ecological crisis is a dangerous time, I don't think needs any elaboration. We hear so much statistics from Bill McKibben, 3050 Org, and others about the effects of the ecological crisis. But I think what has not been fully attended to are the theological implications of that crisis, especially as they relate to poor communities and communities like in Africa. That's what I would like to do this morning, but I have to be careful because I'm reminded by an African theologian from Congo, Kamana, who says that the goal of African theology and Christianity must be to transform Africa rather than just explain it, to change it positively rather than just study it, to create history rather than just interpret it. So I would like to offer one way concretely to live into this challenge by suggesting a concrete model and an experiment that I and the two other participants of mine are undertaking in Uganda. But here is the key argument of my talk. There are, of course, many and complex political, economic, cultural, and policy factors which contribute to the ecological crisis of our time, both at the local and the international level. However, at the basis of these complex factors lies a fundamental theological problem that has to do with our inability to see, to acknowledge, and to feel God's deep connections with the land. In practical terms, the theological problem translates into our failure to live as creatures molded out of the earth and who do not take seriously, or rather have been trying to run away from our vocation to till the land and cultivate it. That's just my argument. But the way I go about it is also connected to my personal experience growing up in Uganda and early 1960s, and what I experience now every time I go back, especially to the village where I grew up in Marube. Growing up, me and my siblings and our parents lived on this small 3-acre plot of land. And every morning at 5 o'clock, our dad would wake us up and go and cultivate and work in the field with him. Around 7 a.m., our work in the field is over. We would run down the forest to a spring where we drew water, came back home, washed quickly, and then ran 2 miles to the school before the 8 a.m. bell to start classes. And at the end of the day, at 4 o'clock, we would again run back home, join our parents in the field and cultivate until around 7 o'clock, then come back to home for dinner. It was a simple life. It did, however, produce enough food and some cash crops like coffee that we sold. I don't want to romanticize this. Life was tough, but at least there was enough problem, and now looking back, I see there was a deep connection with the land that has been lost. Because now when I go back to visit my mother, who still lives in the same village, I cannot but notice that the village has a lot more people living in it, that the forest that surrounded the village has all been cut down for firewood and to make room for cultivation, and there are a number of plots that have been planted with eucalyptus trees that is making the land even more arid. And along the way, I meet so many people, young men, on borders, motorcycles and bicycles, carrying these huge sacks of charcoal from the village to the city. And even more importantly, now when I go to visit my mother in the village, I have to buy food in the city and take to the village. Marube, I think, is not unique. I think it is the experience of many of us living in Africa or many other poor communities, and that's what stands as a vivid image of the then and now. And my argument is that the basis of it, there is a fundamental theological problem. And how that has played out in Africa is what I want to briefly narrate, what has brought us to where we are right now. With the argument that it reflects our attempt to run away from that vocation, till the land, nurture it, and cultivate it. In Africa, I think this has happened at the intersection of two forces. First of all, on the colonial experience, colonialism in Africa had as one of its stated goals to transform primitive African societies into modern societies after the model of Europe. Now, the African village in particular, the deep connection of people, the natives with the land, represented all that was primitive and evil in Africa. The customs, the traditions, the animism, and so forth. These had to be left behind if African communities and individuals were to be brought into the sunny future of civilized modernity. Especially education did a lot in a way to transform the minds of Africans in a way to look at all that is connected with the land as primitive, and therefore to abandon everything that was connected with these primitive ways of living. A simple example that many Africans relate to in our education system: by the time I finished grade school, I could in a way draw and explain the different mechanics of the four-stroke engine. But throughout my education, I never even had a class about bananas, about the goats, about the millet that was the lifeline of our communities. Many of us, of course, had never seen a car, or maybe once now and again we might see one if we went to Kampala. But we mastered the four-stroke engine, but we had no knowledge at all of how to grow bananas and millet or rare goats. The fact is that this education system has been able to produce a whole mass of educated, or should I say semi-educated, half-starving individuals, totally alienated from the land, from their village communities, and loitering around the city, thus contributing to the problem of slums, growing slums in Africa. Now, the other angle, the other trajectory to this story is that the civilizing mission of colonial education and the evangelizing mission of the church often reinforced each other in a number of ways. The enlightenment dualism between matter and mind found its theological nemesis in the body and soul dualism, where the soul was viewed as the spiritual center and the focus of the church's mission, the saving of souls. And so while the education was meant to free us from primitive ways of thinking, which included belief in the sacredness of the land, the evangelizing mission was meant to free us from interest in the material world in order to focus on the other worldly existence whose ultimate goal was the eternal life of the soul in heaven. Now, those of us training church ministry received, so to say, a double portion of this determined effort to detach from anything that was associated with the land, including patterns of growing food. At the seminary, of course, and other church institutions, people were employed to cultivate the fields, but not as seminarians. I do remember, for example, an incident in early 1980s when I was at seminary. We had a number of professors, some of them had studied in America, others in Europe, and came back to the seminary to teach. And they wanted to change, so they said we have to spend a day, 1 day a week, cultivating the field, doing our own cooking, and doing the dishes. We, of course, the seminarians would not hear any of that. In fact, we called these professors dangerous communists. So we went on strike, a sit-down strike. We boycotted the classes, and our logic was very sound, so at least we thought. We were not only college university students, we had come to study philosophy and theology, to grasp the eternal mysteries of being and salvation, to attune our minds to the great thinkers like Hegel and Heidegger and Descartes and Hume, whom we mastered, and our souls to those inner spiritual disciplines, to build, if you like, our own interior castles. And here were these professors telling us to go to the fields. Come on. This was way below us. We had already, in a way, evolved, attained a certain level of civilization that gave us the privilege not to work on the fields in the land. That was the work of people who had never gone to school, of peasants like my parents. I tell this story because I think it captures very well both the existential and theological problem coming together in Africa that has created this kind of mass ecological crisis for the poor communities in Africa. How do we even capture that sense of God who is connected with land and what it means to live within a sense of salvation that is deeply connected with land, especially in Africa? Among other things, I think the story of Genesis chapter 2 will have to play a far more decisive role in shaping the imagination of the church than it has till now played. So I do spend a lot of time working on this chapter 2 of Genesis, kind of laying out the story, but we all know the story. And I kind of identify four main points that arise from that story of the creation in Genesis chapter 2. It's surprising, actually, that story has not played the role it should play for us in Africa, but in the church as well, in shaping the theological imagination. First of all, in that story, what we find is that God loves the soil. We're told that God fashioned everything out of the soil. So you can imagine a picture of God on his knees, on the ground, hands in the soil, soiled hands, that God himself works the land, that God himself loves the land. And two, that God is a farmer. We note in Genesis chapter 2, verse 8 and 9, the Lord God planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed, and the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for the food. Trees that were pleasing, delightful, and good for food. God as a farmer. And three, that man is himself created, fashioned, actually, that's the term, fashioned out of the soil. And so Adam, playing on the word Adama, Adam and Adama, man out of the soil. That intricate connection between man and the soil. And four, that man's vocation is to love and till the earth. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. I like the American version that translates to work it with the cultivate, to work the land and cultivate it. For cultivate has the same connotation as nurture. When you cultivate something, you grow, you nurture. But nurture also has the sense of feeding. And here lies the essential connection and image of the earth as mother. And so there is a mutual mothering. We take care of the earth, we mother the earth, and then the earth mothers us into life. The earth becomes our mother. And how do we get back to that? How does that become a foundational model and imagination for our theological and practical education? How does that shape ways of life, of living in communities, especially communities like in Africa? We do, of course, need a lot of teaching. We do, of course, also need a lot of preaching. But even more than that, we need practical models. We need demonstration plots of what it means to till the land and cultivate it. And this is what presses me and the two priest friends into this practical model that we are designing in Uganda, that we have called the Better Land Institute, an education institute for that kind of practical theology of land, tilling the land and cultivating it. And the vision is that this will serve as an education, but also will be able to train as other communities, village communities, but also seminarians and priests. I was really heartened by the story and the lecture of Chris on Thursday, Chris Hannan, about the reading of American Catholic style. That such experiment actually did exist in the US in the 1930s and 1950s, and they have all been lost. So it's something like that we are trying to do on this 78 piece of land. That we have 3 elements as part of the education institute. 3 elements. One, an organic farm. An organic farm that in a way really represents this effort to till the land, to cultivate it, to nurture it God's way, the same way like God does. But also that kind of encourages and teaches communities, village communities, on how to live on smaller pieces of land. For with the growth of the population, the land has remained the same. And so there is always a sense that Africa cannot feed itself, which I take to be a lie. I think there are ways in which if we live into this vocation, we can show the productivity of the land. So this organic farm, and we have intense year-long internships, and that graduates of this program can go and do the same in their local communities. The second element of this Bethany Land Institute will be a forest. There's huge deforestation in Africa. And so we need to do the reverse process. And so our hope is that within 20 years, within 15 years, at least we will have planted or helped to plant 1 million trees by bringing people to this forest, encouraging communities and students to go back and replant trees in their own communities. And 3, the third element will be a rest stop area. This is quite interesting, a rest stop area. Yes, but even one of you have traveled on many African roads, and you want to go to the bathroom, forget about it, find the next bush, and so we want to do something that would be provocative, in a way, challenge all these policymakers, government, and so forth. That if you build roads, you need to build rest stop areas. But that's also to kind of invite people to live in the image and the vision of rest, of Sabbath, of creation that is connected with this story of creation. At the same time, the rest stop area will be a draw, a kind of hook for people to find out what is going on around here, for people to walk the forest, but at the same time also we have stores where the produce of the land will be marketed. We are calling this the Bethany Land Institute because we're taking inspiration from the story of Bethany, or the stories of Bethany, of Martha, who welcomed Jesus to her house and fed Jesus with all the produce from her land, a very productive, hardworking woman, of Mary, who sits down and listens to the story of God, kind of really connecting it with the theological vision of Lazarus, who is raised from the dead. So as a sign of resurrection, this is how resurrection looks like concretely in this ecological crisis in Africa. By way of conclusion, I want to say that Peter Morin, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker movement in the US, once noted that the main problem with society was that sociology, economics, and politics had all been separated from the gospel. In the process, society had lost any sense of the ultimate, transcendent purpose of human activity. The Bethany Land Institute is an attempt to reconnect sociology, economics, and politics to the story of God that we encounter in Scripture, particularly in Genesis chapter 2. The goal of the attempt is to cultivate a land and care for the land and to reground the mission of the church in our primary calling, in our primary vocation, namely to cultivate and take care of the earth. My hope is that this effort will invest ordinary African lives with a sense of the ultimate and the transcendent that Peter Morin spoke about, and at the same time recreate beauty and abundance in Africa. No doubt, in the face of the immense ecological problems that are facing us, such efforts cannot but appear small and insignificant. But as Dorothy Day used to say, it is little by little that we are saved. Moreover, it is through such a little efforts that we can hope, as Peter Morin and Dorothy Day hoped, to build a new world within the shell of the old. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emmanuel, for getting us off to a very interesting start. Our next speaker is Germán Mahecha Clavijo from the Pontifical Xavieran University, the Universidad Xavieran in Bogotá, Colombia. He, unlike many people in the theology and science dialogue, knows about both theology and science. He has master's degrees in sanitation and environmental development, environmental education, and in theology, and a doctoral degree in pedagogical science from the Central Institute of Pedagogical Science in Havana, Cuba. And he is well published in the areas of environmental education, environmental teaching, and the relationship between science and theology. So we're delighted to have Germán Mahecha here. Please join me in welcoming.
Good morning. I'll try to read in English. It's easy for me. My fluency is limited. Thank you for understanding the bill, the opportunity to move from anonymity to discredit. The poor are the becoming an endangered species. The widespread disparity of information by various media about the consequence of pollution due to gases leaking into the atmosphere, which generates a greenhouse effect and reduces global warming, together with the voice warning about the loss of biodiversity and soil deterioration by the extraction of fossil fuels, which causes loss of forests and diminished water supplies, has made the ecological topic more relevant not only to experts in that field, but it has also questioned the essence of broader range of disciplines, such as theology. An example of this is the magisterium of Paul XVI, St. Paul II, and Benedict XVI, who can be considered the pioneers of this theological reflection, and of course, our Pope Francis, who we are looking forward to his announced environmental encyclical to be published next summer. However, the best example is our presence at the meeting, which demonstrated that the dialogue between theology and ecology is possible and relevant. It has also been presented as a sign of the times. This is how poor, fragile, ecology, and church are presented not only as four categories, concepts, or notions that are found at the basis of the proposed title and to be carried out in the above-mentioned meeting, but they identify themselves as part of the discourse of forest ecology and theology, which are fused in eco-theology, to offer a different look depending on the particular interest each might be concerned about. Addressing them all during my presentation would be a quixotic enterprise. Therefore, I propose myself a minimum common denominator for the four. I have found that the poor brings a possibility to develop an idea that may allow a common thread for me to share my thoughts. Let me share with you some of my personal history, not in vainglory, but as a way of testimony that has allowed me to make sense of my life. When I was asked to participate in this event, the first thing that came to my mind was, we live in a broken world. The famous title published by the Secretariat of Social Apostolate to General Curia of the CWCIT in 1999. The reason? Because it is a text that came to me just the year my son Miguel Angel was born, and served me as a pretext to reflection on what it means to bring a child into the world, which by that time was broken into every way. First, scientists had already announced that up to an altitude of 25 kilometers to the ozone layer had a hole over the North Pole and had enlarged to a size equivalent to the area of the United States, but also due to the fact that social problems involving education, politics, and economics, among others, were stressed even more, becoming an evident rupture of social ties. At that time, education in general, and in particular the environmental one, were asked to implement procedures that may contribute to modify human behavior and thereby be able to establish a new type of relationship with natural resource, which I considered wrongly named natural source. In that moment, I began to question my education as a witness that all theoretical and practical knowledge acquired in the study of biology as part of sanitary and environmental development postgraduate, and even in environmental education postgraduate, had not helped to modify the behavior to those human beings with whom I interact. In that moment, I have to confess that I even thought that it was a matter of pedagogy and didactics, and that's why I did my PhD in educational science. I was seeking a way to sensitive humans who passed through classroom each semester. However, outside class, while celebrating 20 years of the one experience of life that had been created from the family core, it was when I remembered the promise that I made on February 22, 1985. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at the odd times. It came to my mind as a diaphanous idea. The sixth item of the law, the Scout sees in the nature the creative work of God and seeks its conservation and development. At the same time, I contrasted what the author of the Theory of Multiple Intelligence, Howard Gardner, claimed in his book Flexible Minds. After examining various definitions of spirituality, I have come to the conclusion that it does not meet the criteria of intelligence. It was at this point that I started a master in theology, and with it a way in which I could query into a human being's new dimension that my natural science training had not allowed me until that moment. I had not bothered to explore, that is to say, spirituality. This exercise allowed me to make an approach to the future and of an ecological spirituality, and thereby initiate a search which led to me reflect on the relationship between theology and ecology, while coordinating the Eco-theology research team at the Faculty of Theology, Pontifical Universidad Xavieran in Bogotá. And it is in this reflection process we have performed during 13 years as a team, where I discovered that to modify the relationship between man and nature, theologians need to address the issue of environmental values and to include them in religious teaching. Here arises a new call on education, particularly religious education, to start an exercise which has commonly been made from the shores of ecology, especially environmental education, proposing a reflection that generates a change in a relationship between man and nature, but now it comes from two other sides, theology. Hence, the best place to begin this reflection as possible approach is the Holy Scripture, because it is recognized as the soul of the sacred theology. It is therefore the starting point and the axis on which our reflection and theology turns around. That's the focus of the present meeting. The poor will inherit the earth. Literature reports many definitions regarding poverty among cultural, intellectual, and moral are highlighted. However, it has been traditionally regarded as poor those who look material goods. This is the classic European concept, which has been defined as a particular way of being a man and woman in the world. In this way, being poor is a disgrace. It's something negative. It is being less. And although certain values such as solidarity, compassion, or charity are recognized, it has been considered as a condition that must be removed, delayed, in other words, extinguished. For this reason, today, many people do not recognize it is their own condition. But when can one feel or recognize poor? A person may not know how they define what to be poor is like, but surely he knows how to distinguish a poor man from a rich one, merely by the outward appearance of deficiency in material goods. However, it should be clarified that no one talks about material property and as need. They simply refer to them. With this perspective, if people do not perceive themselves to be lacking something, they will not perceive themselves as poor. Therefore, some parameters have been established along the struggle to eliminate poverty, and therefore the poor, and they have been universalized for everybody. An example of this is the case of the one who states about Colombia. The concept of poverty applies to 4-member families in average with monthly income between $156 and $391. This amount is spent in food, housing, clothing, and basic service. The extreme poverty concept applies to families whose monthly income is less than $156, which is spent only in food. The extreme poverty line in Colombia increased 0.7% nationwide to 92,000 COP from July 2013, June 2014. That means that a 4-member home with an income below 1,369,000 COP was nationally ranked as extremely poor, indigent. According to this approach, what can be said of those people who are condemned to live on less than $1 a day? Because data reveals that there are many people who must live that way. This is the case of a student of the Faculty of Science of the Pontifical University Xavieran in Bogotá, whose name is kept in private, who presented this testimony regarding the economic situation of her family during the class where the issue was addressed. I get up to go to school. I shower, I get dressed, and have breakfast. Since I have no break, I have classes all morning. Therefore, I don't eat anything else until lunchtime. My lunch consists of 1,000 cup ham and cheese sandwich. However, sometimes I'm lucky because once in a while some friend treats me or complete meal. During the afternoon, my friend shares a small package of cookies with me. I read directly from books from the library to save money and copies. So I save money that way. Daily I spend 3,000 cups in a round trip on bus rapid system, Transmillennium. And I ask myself, if so far I have spent 4,000 cups, how would my dad, who is unemployed, pay for the apartment, utility service, and our food? Besides that, he has to leave home in order to find a job that pays less than $1 a day. Faced with such a testimony, it is worthwhile to think over the headline of Leonardo Rodriguez's article, which was published by the El Espectador newspaper. The gap between rich and poor in Colombia increases to be worrying. Now is frightening. In the year 2000, Colombia's foreign debt was $16 million. It is estimated that by in year 2015, it will be close to 14,800 million right now. With the previous data, it is evident that poverty has been increasing, which means that poor people are increasing too. Although this fact contradicts the title of my presentation, it is seen that the poor are the so unknown that they are not even taken into account. There is tendency to remove them, to exclude them from the figures, to eliminate them, to extinguish them. As a consequence, it could be stated that the poor are less, first because reality shows that some are dying, but on the other hand, because now, by decree, no one earning a minimum wage can be considered as poor. Faced with this panorama, hope is the only thing left, which according to popular wisdom, is the last thing to lose, because even though the phrase, which is attributed to Jean-Paul Getty, is true, the meek shall inherit the earth, but not the mineral rights. So is the principle of natural selection, of survival of the fittest, formulated by Charles Darwin. Paradoxically, when the prophecies of ecologists and environmentalists are meant, when the greenhouse effect finishes the glaciers, when simultaneously drought and at one end of the planet produce rains and floods by the butterfly effect in these antipodes, and finally generate crises which may lead to the suffering of new disease, hunger, and thirst. That day, the full throne of will be seen. Those who now are considered as the weakest, the poor and impoverished, those who were subject to indifference, to abandonment, to misery, and the misery, including plants and animals. In other words, the entry planet, those will be the ones who could survive in the inhospitable world, which they were brought into by the force of a selection that, although artificial, was seen by many as something natural. If there were only they will be able to survive, to become heirs of a destroyed planet the same as themselves, but with the hope of emerging despite adversities to finally proclaim the triumph of the life over death, resilience. This way, there is hope that the poor are definitely the only ones likely to survive in the fullness of the environmental crisis. The reason is because they are the only representatives of the human species who have been able to endure hunger, to drink dirty water, to resist the inclement weather by only using newsprint, to live without basic health service. And they have even had the courage to overcome the lack of solidarity among their fellow. And on conclusion, war, fragile, ecology, and church are the four categories, concepts, or notions hidden inside this interpretation, but they have been made explicit, not necessarily in that order. When one is able to understand that referring to the world not only pertains to the planet, or even men and women who live on it, but to the group of all created things, to the world where what to animate and inanimate concepts is also included. The inclusion of everything makes reference to the ecosystem where all those created things coexist, and that have been mentioned in the previous definition. It is therefore relevant to talk about ecology, but not in the way the great treatise do so, but even more precisely as it was originally shaped by German biologist Ernst Haeckel in his General Morphology der Organism. It means that when one refers to ecology, fundamentally, it has to do with relationship. This understanding supports the need to give a new direction to the concept, to propose a new paradigm wherefrom the anthropological and biocentrical stance. Human being is to be part of the continuum of evolution integrated into God's plan for the ongoing process of creation. This way, the ecology is no longer limited exclusively to the field of natural science, in particular to biology, but interest it is opened onto a wider horizon where dialogue between different disciplines is relevant and necessary. And it is there where theology has not only an opportunity, but the moral obligation to offer a world hope. It is when the notion of church emerged that traditionally is understood as the congregation of faithful Christians by virtue of baptism, or the whole clergy and people of a country where Christianity has advanced. However, a broader view makes possible to understand that ecclesia translates from Greek assembly or community. As Solon of Athens would say, one of the seven sages of Greece, Whitson, who took this concept to establish a new social order that favored to economic growth and enhanced the direct relationship between citizen and the state in Greece. Currently, it is also defined as a set of organisms of different species that are essential to the balance of an ecosystem and which share the same habitat. And contextualizing the phrase attributed to San Ciprian, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, is then what Darwin claimed acquires its full meaning. Any form that is represented by few individuals is a much greater risk of complete extinction. Thus our fragility is made explicit. For one who departs from the herd, group, community, becomes weak and will not be saved. The best example is shown in the National Geographic documentaries, when the lion is catching a zebra, or with the very presence of the poor man who leaves his family and gets lost in the streets of big cities. Here is evident that eco-theology has important work ahead in trying to promote an altruistic culture, which, although it is not presented as a good strategy for evolution, in the process of humanization, takes of a different meaning, where the believer, who lives in a broken world, enters in their direct ecological relationship with a God who invites us to pick up the leftover piece so that nothing be lost. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Germán. Our next speaker this morning is Father Peter Knox, a Jesuit from Hekima College in Nairobi. He's originally from South Africa, and like many Jesuits, has many different talents. He's served as a full-time parish priest. He's worked in campus ministry at a university. He's taught adult math and science classes. He has a degree in chemistry. And he's also taught theology in Johannesburg and Pretoria. He got his theological doctorate in St. Paul's University in Ottawa, Canada, and has been long interested in the intersection of theology and ecological issues, stemming back from, as he says in his biography, childhood family vacations in South Africa's national parks. So please join me in welcoming Peter Knox.
What I'd like to discuss with you this morning is a number of theories of sustainability. I'm going to go very quickly, very rapidly through 4 different theories of sustainability and then try to see how they apply in Africa. So the 4 theories that I'd like to talk to you are the Club of Rome, the report in 1970, 71. Then we'll do the world's, the Brundtland report, very briefly, the Brundtland report. Then we'll do this Forum for the Future by Jonathan Porritt. This is a British think tank here. And then finally we'll do the Stockholm Institute about planetary boundaries. So we're rapidly going through 1, 2, 3, 4 different theories of sustainability, and then how do they apply in Africa. Many of you will be familiar with this seminal work, The Limits to Growth. As you see there, it was a report of the Club of Rome, and it's talking about the predicament of humankind in the 1970s. It was published or written by a load of authors from the MIT, so it's local stuff. Then in 1987, the United Nations produced this, what's known as the Brundtland Report, 1987. It's the commission, the title is Our Common Future, and it's a report of the World Commission on Environment and Development. And what that report says, it firstly gives us a definition of development, sustainable development. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This notion of sustainable development contains 2 key concepts. The one in green is what I'm considering a green light, which means go ahead, there's a future. The rest of it in red is kind of a slow down sign or a stop sign. So the Brundtland report gives us hope for the future as well as reason to be cautious. So the two concepts. The first concept is the concept of needs, in particular the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given. So needs are something that we all require to go ahead, to make progress with life. But then there are also limitations. A bit like the Club of Rome, there are limitations to growth. There are limitations to all sorts of things that we think are naturals, like population, industrial production, agricultural production. So the Brundtland report picks up the idea of the Club of Rome that there are limitations. We cannot simply carry on growing ad infinitum. So there are limitations which are imposed by the state of technology and social organization, and those limitations are imposed on the environment's ability to meet the present and future needs. So we have needs here, but those needs have to be met, but there are limitations in meeting the needs. Then, if we jump 20 years from the Brundtland report to this group, in Britain, what did I call them? The Forum for the Future. There's this book by Jonathan Porritt called Capitalism as If the World Matters. Porritt is saying that capitalism is the only game in town. There's nothing that's going to replace capitalism. There's nothing in the future which seems to be a better alternative to capitalism. So we have to engage in capitalism as though the world actually makes a difference. So he speaks of 5 different capitals. So there's natural capital, then manufactured capital, and that is converted into human capital or social capital. And then finally, there's financial capital. And sustainable organizations have 12 features that apply to the 5 different capitals about which Porritt is talking. Those capitals interconnect or interflow. So natural capital can be converted to manufactured capital can be converted to financial capital to human capital, or financial capital can be converted to social capital. Natural capital is a certain amount of human capital in it. And Porritt is saying, and the Forum for the Future is saying, that these capitals interconnect, and it's simply sustainability simply requires us to keep a balance of the capitals and to keep the flow going. He doesn't, or the Forum doesn't see that natural capital is limited. Once you've used up all the gold, there is no more gold. Once all the fuel has been used, or once we reach peak oil and there's no more oil, then there is no more natural capital to replace the natural capital on which the industry or people are drawing at the moment. So Porritt is a little bit optimistic, I think somewhat over-optimistic, in assuming that the whole world is sustainable, or our economy is sustainable, the capitalist economy is sustainable, if it is just based on transfers and interconnections of the various capitals. Then in 2009, the Stockholm Institute for Resilience came up with a different idea of sustainability. And they speak of planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries are boundaries within which 9 different criteria, categories, 9 different conditions have to remain in order for the world to remain hospitable for human life. If we transgress boundaries in any of these, then life becomes impossible. Human life becomes impossible on the planet. I'll give you an illustration of that, but this slide is simply to indicate that it's a very new theory that was postulated first in 2009 in Stockholm, and it's been worked on in 2015. This is the most recent version of these 9 planetary boundaries. You'll see some of them have been renamed or rethought or reconceptualized. For example, change in land use has become land system change. Biodiversity loss has become a more positive thing of biosphere integrity. Many of the rest of the same. Chemical pollution has been made slightly broader to include radioactivity and nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are very new technology to help you to get cleaner shoes and cleaner clothes. And nanoparticles are appearing everywhere now as kind of very most often organic chemicals which are residual in the environment. So those are the planetary boundaries. The idea of planetary boundaries is illustrated with this illustration here. So the 9 planetary boundaries: climate change, novel entities. Sorry, I have to look. So going clockwise around the wheel there. Stratospheric ozone depletion, atmospheric aerosol loading, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows, freshwater use, land system change, and biosphere integrity. This is the 2015 version of the 9 planetary boundaries. The green there indicates that with respect to each of these factors, or each of these conditions here, we're within a safe zone. So while we're in the safe zone, it's great for each of these. Then there's a kind of area of uncertainty, which is yellow. So between the blue circle and the red circle, there's an area of uncertainty. And then when you get into the red, you're outside the area of uncertainty. And the theory is saying at the moment, as far as biosphere integrity is concerned, and biogeochemical flows, we've transgressed safe boundaries. We're not in a safe space anymore. And many of these, each of them has its own measure, different concentrations, for example, of nitrogen or nitrates in the soil, different flows of phosphorus, different levels of acidity in the ocean. Many of these are unknown. We don't know what the safe limits are. And so therefore we have to operate with prudence. We have to be as prudent as we can to remain within the limits proposed by this theory. To look at 2 that we know, 2 that we're familiar with. So I've just, if you see what I've done here, I'm just going to take this little section here, the ozone, blow it up a bit. And since the Montreal Protocol, since we've been really concerned about ozone depletion, or the hole in the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol, all countries around the world, for the first time ever, all the countries around the world have signed a UN declaration and have actually come on board. And so we're no longer sort of heading up to the danger zone, but as far as ozone depletion is concerned, the Earth is safe within the green zone. And that's about, so the measurement for that ozone depletion will be different to the measurement for any other criteria that we're looking at. At the moment, the one that concerns us most and the one that's receiving highest priority attention is climate change. And a lot of our concerns about climate change, a lot of the conversations we've had and will be having are about climate change. And according to Rockström, the man in Stockholm, and his colleagues, climate change we're in the area of uncertainty at the moment. We're beyond the safe zone, this green zone here. The Earth is already, since the Industrial Revolution, moved into a zone of insecurity, or a zone of not really knowing what the dangers are. Bill McKibben and the 350org people have said, and so he's trying to promote this as a target, as a boundary within which we should remain. McKibben is saying that 350 parts per million, that is the boundary which we may not cross, which we cannot cross. because that will lead us into catastrophic climate change, and that will have all sorts of knock-on effects to all of these other 8, potentially it'll have knock-on effects onto the other 8 criteria that are being measured. So the movement at the moment is to try and remain within 350 parts per million. That is to go backwards to the concentration of carbon. It's not only carbon dioxide, but carbon, methane, etc., greenhouse gases, to go back to the level of either pre-industrial revolution or what is regarded as something of a safe zone. So what I sort of take from this exercise is that we can't be only climate warriors. If we're dealing only with climate change, if our sort of mentality is that we only have to handle climate change, then we're not dealing with the other 8 danger areas, or the other 8 areas in which life could become very, very inhospitable on this planet, or the planet becomes inhospitable towards life. For example, he shows, or Rockstrom and his colleagues show, that as far as nitrogen is concerned, we're pumping nitrates into the soil. Those nitrates are ending up in rivers, dams, lakes, and water eutrophies. Water gets really, really bad and stagnant because there are algal blooms, and we're in danger zone as far as phosphates and nitrates are concerned, and also in terms of biosphere integrity or the loss of biodiversity. So if we concentrate only on climate, which is pressing and it's important, we're not kind of looking at all the other dangers which are posed to the human family. So there are many greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the best known, but methane is also an important one. Every time you or I pass wind, or every time a bird or a bee or another animal passes wind, methane is being put into the atmosphere. Every time methane is burnt, either carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide is produced. And so, just looking at the climate change, there's a whole science around climate change as well. Let's move the conversation to Africa. Okay. I'll just give you a couple of statistics about Africa. Quick comparison. Africa is a continent of 1.033 billion people, compared with 3.07 million in the contiguous United States. Africa has an area of 30.2 million square miles, which is just over 3 times, close to 4 times the area of the contiguous United States. Africa goes from 37 degrees north to 38 degrees south, whereas the United States, are between 25 and 49 degrees. That's the kind of mainland United States, the contiguous states. Africa has 48 countries, 9 territories. The contiguous states are 48 with 1 territory. Africa has 6 island nations, and obviously not contiguously, but Hawaii is an island state. So just get in your mind that Africa is a big place, and it's impossible for me to speak of the way in which Africa is threatened. I mean, in a way, the title of my talk is misleading, because there is no single African vulnerability or African resilience, because Africa is vast, and we're talking of over 1 billion people. But I'm going to draw some, so having shot myself in the foot, I'm going to go ahead anyway, and I'm going to say, well, this is what, these are areas in which parts of Africa, or various peoples in Africa, are threatened. These are vulnerabilities to these 9 planetary boundaries. Firstly, a lot of our food is produced by small-scale agrarian, in a small-scale agrarian economy. The population, a lot of the population still lives on the land and depends on the land. Poor people mostly are highly dependent and are really concerned about bad climate. What I'm really going to concentrate on is, as I've said up there, climate change, the threat that climate change poses to people in Africa. Our governments are not gifted with a charism of forward planning. Most of our governments do not have large stockpiles or reserves. So when there's a failure of harvest or a failure of crops for 1 year or 2 years, or a couple of years after that, people suffer because we don't have the supplies in stock to continue feeding people through to another better, improved cycle. Our homes, and homes normally, are geared to what is appropriate for that climate, for what people expect. That is culture. People build in ways that are appropriate for their space and time. When there are bad weather events or rare weather events, homes are simply not designed. People are not sheltered sufficiently from rare weather events. And these rare weather events, 5 minutes, yeah, I'm getting there, thanks. These rare weather events are happening more frequently and more severely. The continent is said to be growing economically and in terms of population. When there's growth, there are more mouths to feed, and food production has to be increased, and therefore farmers will hope to start using more inorganic fertilizers, and so that's a problem. There are aspirations as the continent is getting wealthier, or as the middle class is getting wealthier. People aspire to what they see in the developed world, and people want to have one motor car or a couple of SUVs and a nice house, etc., etc. And that's natural. Emmanuel has spoken about it already, that forests are being chopped down because people use a lot of firewood or charcoal for cooking, heavy dependence on firewood, and we get vehicles. You see shiploads of vehicles coming into Eastern Africa every day, 5 years old or older, from Japan, so they're deemed to be unsuitable and therefore ecologically unfriendly for Japan, but they're good enough to be dumped in Africa, and people in Africa are very happy to be driving somewhat cheaper vehicles. Africa has a few points of resilience. Again, Africa, just bear with me while I generalize, please. That we don't have a very high use of nitrates and phosphates, that our farmers rely on biological or organic composting, so we're not poisoning our waters quite as rapidly as happens in other places. We have minimal or almost no use. South Africa is the only country on the continent which has a nuclear power plant and has nuclear research and nuclear medicine, so Africa isn't sort of being polluted by radioactivity. We have vast area, as I pointed out. We have enormous area, almost 3 or 4 times the size of the United States. That means that when problems occur, when climate change happens, for example, people will be able to migrate. There are spaces to which they can go. And this is a mixed blessing. I see Agnes is kind of somewhat flawed by this. But at least there is space for migration. Okay, climate refugees. We have an epistemological hurdle. John Mbiti says that Africans are notoriously religious. Every little group has its own religious ways and its own religious people, own religious ways of thinking. And so people think in terms of human causation or of spiritual causation, personal causation. They don't think in terms of what I put in inverted commas, science. I, as a scientist trained in the Western way of thinking, have difficulty communicating things about chemicals and about radioactivity or nanoparticles. I can't really speak easily to ordinary African people. The question is then, the hurdle we have to overcome is how to explain complicated theories in order to encourage people to change their lifestyles or to change their aspirations in an environmentally friendly way. And then my last slide, we turn to Catholic social teaching. Because, for example, I've got a quotation here from Benedict XVI, Africae Munus was the post-synodal apostolic exhortation after the Second African Synod. Benedict is using personal language, so that's very appropriate for African people to understand, talking of men and women, governments, and financial groups, so persons who are agents here, rather than chemicals or forces, the agents are persons, Some businessmen and women, governments and financial groups are involved in programs of exploitation, and then he picks up on some of the global boundaries or planetary boundaries: pollution, desertification, extinction or biodiversity, and then he speaks of the entire survival of humanity, which is what the planetary boundaries theory is about. People, importantly, are involved in programs of exploitation which pollute the environment. They cause unprecedented desertification, which is about land system use, or land system changes in land system use. Serious damages done to nature, to forests, to flora, to fauna, which people can relate to. They're concrete. They're not sort of gases up in the air. And countless species risk extinction. So putting it in real concrete terms, what this biodiversity threat is. All of this threatens the entire ecosystem and consequently the survival of humanity. So Benedict XVI here is using ordinary language that African people would relate to more easily, saying this is what he's kind of condensed, the theory of planetary boundaries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. Our final speaker for this morning is the Bishop Emeritus of Santa Rosa de Copán in Honduras, Luis Alfonso Santos Villeda. He served for, oh gosh, I have to do quick math here, 27 years as Bishop of the Diocese. He holds a PhD in philosophy and theology from the Pontifical Salesian University in Rome. And he also taught philosophy at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras. And he's also been, in addition to being a pastor, a bishop, and an academic, he's also been an activist. He's been one of the founders of the Civic Alliance for Democracy in Honduras, and also the National Commission for the Development of Alternative Non-Formal Education. So we're very pleased to have Bishop Santos Villeda with us. Please welcome him.
Gracias por invitarme a este evento universitario.
Thank you for inviting me to this university event.
Escribió Agustín de Hipona que en todo acto cognoscitivo está presente el Espíritu Santo. Ustedes están dedicados al conocimiento. Son afortunados de tener por compañero al Espíritu Santo en todo lo que conocen. Antes de venir aquí, he pedido al Espíritu Santo sus luces para que ustedes gocen de la presencia del Espíritu en todo lo que yo voy a hablar y ustedes van a escuchar. Que todo ello sirva para la mayor gloria de Dios y el provecho de ustedes y de Honduras, manteniendo una relación amigable con la naturaleza. Pidamos a Dios que la fuerza del Espíritu Santo triunfe sobre la ambición de aquellos que, destruyendo la tierra, destruyen también a la humanidad.
Augustine of Hippo wrote that in every cognitive act the Holy Spirit is present. You are dedicated to knowledge. You are lucky to have the Holy Spirit as a companion in everything you come to know. Before coming here, I asked the Holy Spirit for His light so that you may enjoy the presence of the Spirit in everything I am going to say and you are going to hear. May it all be for God's greater glory, for your own benefit, and for Honduras, so that we may keep a friendly relationship with the environment. Let us ask God that the strength of the Holy Spirit may triumph over the ambition of those who destroy the earth, destroying also humanity in the process.
Vengo de Honduras, un país que en un 67% todavía es agropecuario. Nací en una zona agrícola, zona montañosa, con un clima agradable, donde hay nichos ecológicos de extraordinaria belleza natural, entre ellos la Reserva Biológica del Huizayote, la Cordillera del Celaque y el Parque Nacional de Santa Bárbara. Son montañas que llegan a los 6.000 pies de altura, con nacimientos de agua potable y abundante vegetación. Allí ha vivido la gente que por siglos ha cultivado la tierra, ha criado sus ganados y ha mantenido el equilibrio ecológico. En estas montañas, a la altura requerida, se cultiva el café, que por su calidad ha ganado premios internacionales. Amo la zona donde nací y amo a Honduras, porque es mi patria. Honduras es un territorio pequeño, 112.600 kilómetros cuadrados de superficie, pero es un territorio lleno de riquezas naturales y de gran belleza. Honduras tiene costa en el Atlántico, con lindas playas que hacen atractivo el turismo. Honduras tiene un departamento insular, Islas de la Bahía. En la isla de Roatán se encuentra un arrecife de coral que es el segundo más grande del mundo. Entre otros atractivos turísticos están los templos clásicos que nos recuerdan la colonia española, los vestigios de antiguas y desaparecidas culturas, como la descubierta últimamente en la Mosquitia, y las mundialmente famosas ruinas de Copán, declaradas por la UNESCO Patrimonio de la Humanidad.
I come from Honduras, a country that is still 67% agricultural. I was born in a farm area. It was a mountainous region with a pleasant climate where there are ecological alcoves of extraordinary natural beauty, like the biological reserve of Huizayote, the Celaque mountain chain, and the Santa Barbara National Park. Some of these mountains reach 6,000 feet in height, with fresh water springs and abundant vegetation. People who live there have cultivated the earth for centuries, have raised cattle, and kept an ecological balance. In these mountains, at the required altitude, they grow a type of coffee that has won international awards for its quality. I love the area where I was born, and I love Honduras because it is my motherland. Honduras is a small country. Its surface is around 70,000 square miles, but it is a land full of natural riches and of great beauty. Honduras has an Atlantic coast with beautiful beaches that attract tourists, and one region is comprised of islands, the Islas de la Bahía. The island of Roatán has the second largest coral reef in the world. Among other tourist attractions, there are classical temples that remind us of the Spanish colonization. There are traces of ancient, extinct cultures like the one recently discovered in Mosquitia, and the world-famous ruins of Copán, declared Patrimony of Humanity by UNESCO.
Pero toda esa belleza antes descrita está siendo amenazada el día de hoy por la industria extractiva, minería metálica e hidrocarburos. Hace 122 años, por los años de 1880, una compañía minera estadounidense que comenzó con el nombre de New York en Honduras, Rosario Mining Company, venía explotando minerales al principio en el municipio de San Juancito, Francisco Morazán, donde dejó 300 kilómetros de túneles, y desde 1949 esta compañía extrae minerales en la aldea de El Mochito, Las Vegas, Santa Bárbara. Recientemente esta compañía vendió todo a una compañía minera australiana de nombre Nistar. Se dice que las compañías mineras tienen tanto dinero en Honduras que pueden decidir qué partido político gana las elecciones. En la década de los años 90 entraron los mineros canadienses, al principio con la Greenstone minera, luego Minosa, luego Yamana Gold y ahora Mineralis. Su explotación minera se ubica en las aldeas de Platanares, San Miguel, San Andrés y Azacualpa, del municipio de la Unión Copán. Están usando el método de extracción atajo gigante y cielo abierto y utilizan el cianuro que contamina la tierra, el aire y el agua, pero les deja grandes ganancias porque separa el 97% de las partículas del oro. Todas las compañías se amparan en el Tratado de Libre Comercio entre Centro y Norteamérica llamado CAFTA, CIFTA. Estas industrias mineras basadas en ese tratado se sienten con derecho a destruir la ecología de Honduras. Utilizan sistemáticamente la corrupción de los medios de comunicación, financian equipos de fútbol y se han apoderado del gobierno de Honduras en el triple poder ejecutivo, legislativo y judicial.
However, all the beauty described above is today being threatened by the extractive industry, metal mining and hydrocarbons. 122 years ago, about 1880, a U.S. mining company that was then called New York and Honduras Rosario Mining Company started exploiting minerals. At the beginning in the town of San Juancito in Francisco Morazan, where it left 300 kilometers of tunnels around 186 miles. And from 1949 in the village of Mochito. Recently, this company was bought by an Australian mining company called Nistar. They say that these companies have so much money that they can decide which political party which will win the elections in Honduras. In the 90s, Canadian mining companies came in. First with Greenstone Mining Company, then with Minosa, then with Yamana Gold, and now with Aura Mineralis. Their mining exploitation is located in the villages of Platanares, San Miguel, San Andrés, and Azacualpa in the municipality La Unión, Copán. Their extraction method is open-cut mining, and they use cyanide, which contaminates the ground, the air, and the water, but gives them great profits because it separates 97% of the gold particles. All these companies shelter under the free trade agreement between Central and North America called CAFTA, C-A-F-T-A. Supported by this treaty, they feel they have the right to destroy the ecology of Honduras. They use corruption systematically, they corrupt the communications media, they finance soccer teams, and they have seized the Honduras government in its three branches, executive, legislative, and judicial.
En el año 1998, las compañías mineras obtuvieron que los diputados del Congreso Nacional abolieran el Código de Minería anterior, promulgaran un nuevo decreto que aumentara las ganancias de las compañías mineras a costa de las ganancias de Honduras. En el año 2013 se promulgó un nuevo decreto ley, actualmente en vigencia, que favorece totalmente a los mineros extranjeros, contemplando apenas 21 centavos por ciento de dólar americano de ganancia para Honduras, además del canon territorial que es de 25 centavos de dólar americano por año por hectárea. Como se ve, las empresas mineras se llevan casi toda la riqueza de Honduras. Además de esos 21 centavos por ciento del dólar americano, la mitad se destina para el Ministerio de Seguridad, es decir, para la Policía Nacional Civil y para la Policía Militar. Según informaciones confidenciales, se han presupuestado miles de millones de lempiras para la seguridad de las empresas que vengan a invertir en Honduras, pero no para la seguridad del pueblo. En el gobierno del periodo 2010-2013 se aprobaron 12 decretos ley para entregar a empresas extranjeras nuestros mares, bosques, montañas, fuentes de agua y biodiversidad, y garantizar la impunidad de las empresas violadoras del ambiente y que violen los derechos humanos. Con todo el apoyo de un Estado hondureño totalmente vendido y dominado por las empresas extranjeras, ha aumentado la prepotencia de dichas empresas, sometiendo a los pobladores por medio de las Fuerzas Armadas, la Policía Nacional Civil y la Policía Militar, destruyendo templos, removiendo aldeas enteras, sacando los muertos de los cementerios para extraer el oro que se encontraba en el subsuelo. Estas compañías sobornan a las corporaciones municipales con donaciones de dinero, donaciones de vehículos, además costeándoles viajes caros y comprándoles bienes sobrevalorados.
In 1998, they were able to obtain from the elected members of the National Congress an abolition of the previous Code of Mining. They instead enacted a new decree that increased the earnings of the mining companies at the cost of Honduras' earnings. In 2013, a new decree, which is in force today, was promulgated, heavily favoring foreign miners while giving only a profit of 0.21% cents of the American dollar to Honduras, besides the land profit of 0.25 cents per year per hectare. As you can see, the mining companies get most of the riches of Honduras. Besides the 0.21% cents, half is destined to the Honduran Department of Security, which is the civil national police and the military police. According to confidential reports, they have budgeted billions of lempiras for the security of the mining companies that come to invest in Honduras, but not for the security of the people. In the period between 2010 and 2013, the government approved 12 laws to give to foreign companies our seas, our forests, our mountains, our sources of waters, and our biodiversity, and guarantee the impunity of the enterprises that were violating the environment and human rights. With the full support of a Honduran government totally bought and dominated by foreign companies, the control of such companies has increased. They subdue the inhabitants through the armed forces. They destroy temples and destroy entire villages, even removing dead bodies from the cemeteries in order to obtain the gold found in the ground. These companies bribe the municipal boards with donations of money, vehicles, paying for expensive trips for them, or buying them overrated goods.
Además de la corrupción, tenemos que hablar de la contaminación que producen las compañías mineras. En el año 2006 hubo un derrame de 29 millones de galones de agua con cianuro en la mina San Andrés de la Unión Copán. Este derrame llegó a los ríos, matando las especies acuáticas, envenenando ganado vacuno que bebió el agua y matando incluso a las aves de rapiña que comieron las vacas muertas. Todo eso fue debidamente documentado. Un biólogo italiano, utilizando su propio equipo de laboratorio, detectó metales pesados en el agua del río Lara, que es un afluente del río Higuito, de donde toma el agua potable la ciudad de Santa Rosa de Copán, que tiene una población aproximadamente de 50.000 habitantes. Actualmente se sabe por informaciones extraoficiales que desde hace 5 años hay un derrame de aguas ácidas en la mina San Andrés de la Unión Copán.
Besides this corruption, we must speak about the pollution that mining companies produce. In 2006, there was a spill of 29 millions of gallons of water with cyanide in the San Andrés mine in La Unión Copán. This spill went into the rivers, killing water species, poisoning the cattle that drank the water, and even killing the birds of prey that ate the dead cows. All this has been duly documented. An Italian biologist, using his own laboratory equipment, detected heavy metals in the water of the Lara River, which is a tributary of the Higuito River, from where the city of Santa Rosa de Copán, which has a population of approximately 50,000 people, takes its drinking water. Now we know through non-official information that for 5 years there has been a spill of acid water in the San Andrés of the Union Copán.
Todo lo anterior lo hemos denunciado en tiempo y forma, ya que recibimos ilustraciones desde el punto de vista legal y desde el punto de vista médico sobre los daños contaminantes de las minas. Por esta denuncia fuimos brutalmente reprimidos por la Policía Nacional Preventiva, que en ese tiempo recibía de la mina combustible para la movilidad de sus patrullas. Laicos y sacerdotes fueron golpeados, entre ellos el vicario general de la diócesis, el padre Reginaldo García Vázquez. Como ustedes pueden constatar en un video que les será presentado. Ese día la represión fue comandada desde un helicóptero que sobrevolaba la zona de la manifestación por un militar del tristemente famoso batallón 316, cuerpo de represión en los años 80, que causó 184 asesinados desaparecidos.
We did formally denounce all of the above in due time, given the fact that we had legal and medical proof about the damage that the pollution of the mines had caused. Because of these complaints, we were brutally repressed by the Preventive National Police, which at the time was receiving fuel for patrolling the mines. Lay people and priests were beaten, among them Father Reginaldo García Vázquez, as you will see in a video we are going to present. That day, an army officer directed the repression from a helicopter that was flying over the area of the demonstration. He was a former soldier of the sadly famous Battalion 316, a body of repression that in the 80s caused the murder of 184 missing people.
En estos últimos 14 años ha crecido la voracidad de las compañías mineras atraídas por el precio del oro en el mercado internacional y lo barato que les resulta su adquisición en Honduras y lo poco que pagan ante la corrupción de autoridades a todo nivel, ya que Honduras es el país más corrupto de Centroamérica y el segundo más corrupto de América Latina. Con lo dicho anteriormente se ha venido a demostrar la veracidad de aquella afirmación que dice que la minería en un país pobre solo sirve para producir ganancias enormes a las compañías explotadoras, para crear contaminación del ambiente, aumentar la corrupción pública y privada y provocar la convulsión social.
In these last 14 years, the greed of the mining companies has increased. They are attracted by the price of gold in the international market and the cheap price they pay for its acquisition in Honduras, plus the corruption at all levels. In fact, Honduras is the most corrupt country of Central America and the second most corrupt in Latin America. With what I mentioned before, we can prove how true the saying is that mining in a poor country only serves to give enormous profits to the exploiting companies, pollute the environment, increase corruption at public and private levels, and provoke social convulsion.
Para una mayor información sobre el tema propuesto en esta semana respecto a las industrias extractivas y la teología intercultural, los invito a ver la bibliografía que al final se detalla.
If you want more information on the topic proposed this week regarding extractive industries and intercultural theology, please consult the bibliography listed at the end.
Bibliografía: Industrias extractivas, minería e hidrocarburos, la problemática de los recursos naturales no renovables en América Latina y la misión de la Iglesia. Documento conclusivo del Seminario Internacional Lima, Perú, 14-16 julio de 2011, en que estuve presente. Segundo, revista Perspectivas del Desarrollo, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Honduras, posgrado latinoamericano en trabajo social, doctorado en ciencias sociales con orientación en gestión del desarrollo, Tegucigalpa, Honduras, diciembre de 2011. Tercero, Conferencias Generales del Episcopado Latinoamericano, Río de Janeiro, Medellín, Puebla y Santo Domingo. Cuarto, Conclusiones de la quinta conferencia realizada en Aparecida, Brasil, en mayo de 2007. Ante la destrucción del ambiente por la contaminación causada por las compañías mineras, no me queda más que lanzar un grito de SOS al mundo en defensa de los pobres pueblos indígenas que se ven obligados a abandonar hasta los huesos de sus muertos en manos de las compañías mineras. Me permito presentarles un corto video para mayor ilustración.
There are 4 items in the bibliography, one on the extraction situation in the mining from Lima, Peru, from magazine Perspectivas del Desarrollo, and it's a thesis in social sciences from Honduras, and notes from the General Conference of the Latin American Bishops, and the conclusion of a Brazilian 5th conference in Aparecida in 2007. Faced with the destruction of the environment due to pollution caused by the mining companies, I can only launch an SOS, an appeal to the world for help, in defense of the poor indigenous peoples who are forced to abandon even the bones of their dead to the hands of the mining companies. Please allow me to present a short video that further illustrates what I've talked about.
¿Qué es lo que tiene mi patria? Que la mantiene de pie. Luego de tanta violencia, de tanta miseria, de tanta mala fe. La atacaron por la espalda, Judas la vendió otra vez. Y ante el terror y la falsa, no busca venganza y no pierde la fe. Sigue rezando y cantando su Cristo moral de aquella pared.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senor. I would invite the speakers to come back up. We've got about a half an hour now for conversation, and we've seen a lot of common themes in the papers presented this morning. Colonialism, the effects of environmental devastation on the poor, resources within the church to resist. So I'd like to first just give the four speakers the opportunity to interact with one another and perhaps respond to each other's papers, ask some questions. Hemos visto algunos temas en común entre las presentaciones esta mañana: el colonialismo, los pobres, los recursos en la iglesia para responder. Así que voy a invitarles a los parlantes a responder unos a otros y después vamos a dar la palabra, la oportunidad a la gente aquí para hacer preguntas y conversación también. Then we're going to open up the possibility for the audience to ask questions and have conversation as well. But if you first want to ask questions, respond to one another's papers, I'll give you that opportunity.
You're not going to kick us off?
No.
Okay.
I can, if you want me to present a question, but I'm just going to give you all the opportunity first.
I'm happy to start. I'd like to ask Germán. Is this okay? Is that okay? Okay. Germán, thank you for your paper. Thank you very much. My question is, you say that the poor will survive. My understanding is that the poor are the most vulnerable. The poor are most often in the places where any kind of global threat affects them most and affects them first. And they have the least resilience and the least ability to protect themselves from any environmental threat. Can you elaborate on why you say the poor will survive most?
Sí. Ok. Voy a contestar en español. ¿Me pueden entonces colaborar?
I'm going to be answering in Spanish, so if I can have the interpreters help me.
Okay. Fundamentalmente pienso que los pobres efectivamente son los más vulnerables.
I basically think that the poor are the most vulnerable.
Pero en el concepto de resiliencia
But talking about resilience,
aparece la posibilidad de enfrentar la adversidad.
there appears to be a possibility that adversity will be confronted.
En ese sentido, el pobre es el que está mucho más fortalecido para enfrentar las inclemencias de un cambio social, ambiental, político, económico.
In this sense, the poor seems to be more adept and have been able to adapt better to all the adversities of the political, social, ecological changes that are taking place, because they have been strengthened by the experience.
Por eso, el título de la presentación, cuando se lee en español, es mucho más diciente.
Thus, the title of my presentation, when read in Spanish, is a lot more telling and revealing.
Es una posibilidad de hacer la pregunta si efectivamente es una especie en vía de extinción porque están muriendo, o es una especie en vía de extinción, porque de alguna manera son los que tienen realmente la capacidad de sobrevivir al final cuando llegue el fin de los tiempos.
So the question is, are they really going to be extinct and going to be impacted negatively by this, or because of the resilience and their ability they have survived under difficult conditions made them stronger in order to be able to survive under the changes that are to come?
Gracias. Yeah, let me also add one or two comments about this, because my paper also assumes something like this, that even though this ecological crisis is affecting the poor disproportionately negatively, my assumption also is that it will be from these poor communities that we might actually get fresh ways and experiments of how to live. And my assumption, one of the reasons for my assumption, one is just practical, is that it's because these poor communities are not so wedded and hooked onto the economic logic of modern capitalism that actually is greatly responsible for bringing us to this ecological crisis. That they can therefore find spaces for innovation, for inventiveness within those gaps, if you like, that are not yet wholly consumed or taken over within this economic logic. So they can find, or they can at least invent fresh ways of economic models that in a way reflect more what I was calling the biblical vision of cultivating and taking care of the land. So that I think that was also one reason why I think poor communities might provide a way of how to innovate and live within the ecological crisis that we are in.
Are there other questions or responses amongst the speakers that you'd like to direct towards each other's papers? If not, I have a question that I want to direct to you all and see if, what your responses are. There seems to be a tension in Catholic thought between responses to the environment that are centered on humans and responses to the environment that are centered on the earth. Cardinal Turkson's paper that he gave, which should be in everybody's folder, kind of goes through some of the history, the recent history of papal responses, and they tend to be human-centered, and for good reasons. I think the popes were concerned that the poor not be seen as a kind of obstacle to the environment. You know, the whole kind of population limitation, I think, was very much on the Pope's agenda, not to just see people as something that scars the earth, but rather see them as people that are valued in their own. But Father Perry last night, the head of the Franciscan order, gave an interesting talk where he said that he thinks that Catholic papal social teaching is moving more towards not just being earth-centered, as seeing the earth as something that serves the human interests, but also as being earth-centered at the same time. And Emmanuel, I think you touched on that, where you kind of described God as a lover of the soil in that way. And so I wanted to see if you all could respond to that tension. There's a sort of tension between kind of earth-centered and human-centered approaches that came up, I think, in each of your papers. And I just want to see if you can respond to that tension and talk about creative ways of resolving that tension or maintaining the tension.
Well, I can begin. I think, yes, I can see or feel the tension. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that actually it is a false tension. We think that either the solution will be Earth-centered or human-centered. And part of the tension, I think, arises from our attempt to leave God out of the picture. But if you, at least from a Christian point of view, if you are operating within the theological imagination, where Scripture, as I said, provides the foundation, and where God, in a way, is providing that imagination, then the tension between earth and human kind of seems to disappear or not be as acute. On the contrary, if you read the story of Genesis, chapter 2, you really see that organic connection, earth and the human, Adam and Adama, soil out of which he is made. So there is a sense in which a theological, scriptural imagination can provide a way out of that tension. And I say this not only because I'm a theologian, but I see that our attempts to deal with this question of ecology without attending to the deep theological, spiritual roots of the problem fall short of what is required to live in a holistic and integral manner. But that also captures a sense of our being creatures, that we human beings are creatures, are created, and created out of the soil and have that deep connection out of that soil. So our attempt to run away from that, I think, is a theological problem, a spiritual problem, and how to capture a sense of that. The other minor point I might want to add, especially for communities in the global south, African communities that who still, in a way, live, thank God, within a spiritual framework, within a religious framework. They appeal to a sense of transcendence and a sense of God, in a way, takes away the burden of thinking it is either the earth or human beings. Human beings themselves are caught up within an organic, holistic context and atmosphere whereby something bigger, more than any of us or the earth kind of holds us. And that's a kind of a spiritual dimension and element. I think that might kind of help to ease that tension or dissolve that tension between us and humans.
Tengo en mi experiencia personal la posibilidad de dar clases a estudiantes universitarios.
In my personal experience, I have been able to teach to college students.
Y en ese sentido les planteo una triada, Dios, hombre y mundo.
So I propose to them that there's a triad: God, man, and world.
En ese sentido, hombre y mundo son una realidad, estamos aquí, el hombre en el mundo.
So in that sense, man and world, we're both here. Man are in the world.
Y lo que diría Simón de Laplace, Dios aparece como un factor.
And as Simon de Laplace would say, God appears therein as a factor.
Y el factor Dios puede afectar esa relación entre hombre y mundo.
And the God factor may affect that relationship between man and world.
En mi perspectiva de creyente, Dios está con nosotros y es el que nos anima, es la resiliencia que nos permite precisamente sobrevivir en este planeta.
As a believer, I think God is with us, and He is the one that motivates us and that provides us with this resilience in order for us to be able to survive on this planet.
Por eso es importante entender la presencia de este hombre en el mundo. O bien, el hombre
sin Dios o el hombre con Dios.
So it is important to understand the presence of man on earth in the world. That is, a man with God or a man without God.
En ese sentido, ¿qué imagen de Dios tenemos?
And in that regard, what is the image of God that we have?
El Dios que creó y se fue, se alejó.
Is it the God that created and then left us and went away?
O el Dios presente, resucitado con nosotros.
Or is it the God that is present, who is resuscitated and who is with us?
Por eso para mí ecología no es una rama de la ciencia.
So to me, ecology is not a branch of science itself,
Sino que se trata de relaciones entre hombre, naturaleza y por supuesto Dios.
rather a relationship between man, nature, and of course God.
Thanks for your question, Bill. A bit as Emmanuel has responded, I would say that's a false dichotomy, if I may. Stephen Bevins, I think it's in Models of Contextual Theology, he speaks of theology of creation versus theology of redemption. Are you familiar with that distinction? Theology of creation means that's kind of somewhat more Catholic, it's somewhat more, it has a more positive anthropology, that kind of our theology is focused on the act of creation, the act of God putting man on the planet and God having man here in Genesis, man, women, okay. In Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, whereas a theology which is more redemption-centered seems to be more Lutheran, Calvinist, Protestant inclined, that the first reality is of fallen creation, Genesis chapter 3 based theology. And Bevins says that this is really a false dichotomy because Genesis chapter 3 is already enclosed in, or already presumed in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The fall is already presupposed in the way that Genesis 1 and 2 creation is set up. And so the fact that Christ comes into the world to redeem is already there right from the start. It's already the second person of the Trinity is already there, part of who God is, with a mission. As Genesis 3 is presupposed in Genesis 1 and 2, similarly, Genesis 1 and 2 obviously have to be part of Genesis chapter 3. There's no possibility of a fall if there isn't a world, or there isn't a human creature who falls, who has been created by God and yet who falls. So the dichotomy is somewhat artificial, that you have a creation redemption or redemption, salvation redemption centered theology, as the human-centered or earth-centered theology isn't exactly a possibility, as Germán has just pointed out, that man is presupposed, or God is presupposed in the relationship between man, humans, and the world.
Sí. Veo muchas semejanzas entre el continente africano y el subcontinente latinoamericano.
I see a lot of similarities between the African continent and the Latin American subcontinent.
Porque somos regiones del mundo históricamente explotados.
Because we are regions of the world that have been historically exploited.
En segundo lugar, felicito a DePaul University por esta idea del catolicismo y el mundo y la teología intercultural.
So I'd like to congratulate at the same time DePaul for this idea of Catholicism, the
Nos da oportunidad a los pobres de expresarnos, lo cual honra a San Vicente de Paul.
Because it gives us Catholics, the poor Catholics, the opportunity to express ourselves. So we thank Saint Vincent of DePaul.
No me gustaría que la discusión fuera si los pobres desaparecen o no desaparecen.
I would not like the discussion to be about the fact that are the poor to disappear or not to disappear.
Porque la realidad es que existen.
Because the reality is that they do exist.
Y estamos en esa línea no solo de pobreza, sino del subdesarrollo en que nos han descrito los países desarrollados.
Along those lines, not only do we exist, but we are along the lines of underdevelopment as described by more developed countries.
Veo una coincidencia entre la exposición de Katongole y de Germán, y agradezco, y la exposición mía, que es una denuncia profética más que todo, es un testimonio de un testigo que estuvo en la represión.
I see that there's a coincidence, a convergence between what Katongole said and what Herman saw, because it's some sort of a prophetic denouncement that is being made by us.
Y también la exposición del padre Knox nos da oportunidad a los que vivimos en la ciudad de cómo podríamos aprender sobre el ambiente y también luces como cuidarnos y cómo cuidar el planeta. Gracias.
And also the words by Father Knox, who enables us to see how we can learn from the environment and sheds some light as to how we can take care of our planet. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So let's go ahead and open it up for questions and comments from the audience. If you would, please use the microphone because we're recording the session and we'd like to get it on tape.
Thank you all for your presentations. I'm a little too tall. This question draws mostly on Emmanuel's presentation, but it's really open for everyone to answer. Emmanuel, I really appreciated your pointing us to Genesis 2:15 and the vocation of gardener there, so Genesis 2 in general. And I agree with you that I think that's a really important area for us to consider the theology that's tied to that chapter. And in fact, if I may connect two dots that you point to, that God's first image as gardener or farmer there, and then we see the vocation given to the human to be a farmer or gardener. And so there's actually an implicit imago Dei anthropology there. So it's in, sorry, I'm so nervous. It's in cultivating and caring for the earth and all that comes from the earth that we actually most fully image God. So I think that's actually an incredibly important symbol going forward for us. My question is whether or not, though I have many sympathies towards agrarianism, whether we should identify that symbol with the agrarianism. In light of the subsequent presentations, it seems to me that part of the work of Gardener today is to resist structural sin, structural evil that's exploiting and dominating and exhausting the earth and all that comes from the earth, the soil and all that comes from the soil. And so, while I think certainly one element of Gardener is agrarian work, I think it's also social movements that call corporations to task, work on bringing us back within planetary boundaries, and so on and so forth. So I'd be interested in all of your thoughts on that. Thank you.
With
Well, thank you very much, Don. Yeah, I like you are invoking the Imago Dei in the Genesis chapter 2, the image of God there. In fact, some of the things that I didn't say in my exploration and analysis of the text is that when God gives vocation to man to cultivate, to till the land and take care of it, that follows in a way all these series of patterns of work that God has done in fashioning, in farming, in working the soil, and then it kind of gives the vocation. In other words, he's asking human beings to do it in the same way as God does. My argument is that right there in that verse 15 is the same command, is the same sentiment as in Genesis chapter 1. Man and female, he created them in his own image. Genesis chapter 2 does not use the language on his own image, but right there in that verse, that is the same sentiment that is expressed. That do this, and doing so in a way is what brings us into that Imago Dei, into that very image of God that is often invoked in relation to chapter 1. So I completely, totally agree with you, and I think that is where the kind of analysis of this text leads. The second point too, that it is not just an agrarian indication, it's not just kind of pointing to ways of recovering forms of agriculture, but also resisting other forms of earth exploitation. That's true. What I wanted to do is, from my own point of view in relation to Africa, I see that the immediate call that this text makes is in a way to kind of recover models and forms of farming, of taking care of the land in the same way that God does. And that kind of really renders itself, especially in a place like Africa, where people are still so much living on land, in kind of small plots of land, small holdings and so forth, that this text can actually exercise a very, very powerful theological imagination. But it's definitely connected with all other forms that kind of, whether it is economics, whether it is extractive industries, that really, instead of taking care of the land, taking care of the earth, that actually just kind of wrecks the earth. So I see the deep connections, and I hope we can read all the other presentations in light of that Genesis 1 to kind of narrate what is happening in different places. I want to just put it in relation to Africa.
Thank you. I want to jump back to the conversation, Earth versus human, a bit, and I first of all to just offer, I think I'm grateful for the reflections of the indigenous peoples, particularly, to take us away from the Platonic and Aristotelian models of everything. But I do think one piece that is helpful, at least to me, comes from Bonaventure, where Bonaventure, both in the Xavieran and in his writing, Christological writing, he speaks of something like this, and all things are transformed in Christ, and speaking then of Christ. With the stone he shares existence, with plants he shares life, with angels he shares intelligence, and with humans he shares the image, and then he talks about the perfect image being God. And I often think that that's helpful a bit to North Americans and Europeans in maybe making a transition, because I think sometimes we have taken away all of the animism. The whole notion of the creator spirit is often absent from any of our systematic theological treatments or conversations. And that leads me then to my question. With Trinity, on the one hand, I find that a really helpful image of God in the sense that we have the three equal persons in mutual relations. But then after that, what do you say to ordinary persons in the pew? And I would presume that the reflections of indigenous peoples and cultures that are more communitarianly oriented would have a whole lot more to say than what we as North Americans say. And I would just appreciate any of your reflections in regard to that. Is it possible? Can we use the model of Trinity as a way to help people understand God and therefore the entire relationality of all of creation that somehow images God in the Platonic?
May I respond to that? Because I was teaching that 2 weeks ago. I've just finished a course in Trinity undergraduate. The three persons of God they have everything in common except for their relationships. They're defined in terms of their relationships to one another. So procession, sonship, fatherhood, paternity, spiration, being breathed out. In Africa we say, in many cultures in Africa, we say, a person is a person because of other people. You make me who I am. I cannot be myself without the relationships that have defined me and that will continue to define me. And so we say that, and I don't think I'm being I'm not straying far from Orthodox theology to say that the persons within the Trinity are defined in terms of their relationships to each other. Everything else they have, all their attributes, all their properties, they have in common. So, and you'll find that in the Pseudo-Athanasian Creed, repeated again and again and again. And so we are also defined, I think, or are at least identified by our relationship with the soil, by our relationship to the earth from which we come. So that's going beyond your immediate Trinity question, going back to the dichotomy that you were sort of putting up again between man, humans, and the earth. We come from the soil, we will return to the soil, and the elements which have made us will become the elements which will make the people who will follow us, ultimately. I'm not sure that helps.
The text that comes to mind, actually, as we are talking, was coming to mind was the text of Colossians chapter 1, I think it's from verse 15, 17, when Paul goes into this hymn, all things were created in heaven and earth, and everything holds together is the Christ, the image of the invisible God, the holding together. I thought that was that came to my mind as we were talking that text of Colossians. Of Colossians chapter 1. But in terms of the image of the Trinity, the notion of the Trinity, yes, I really feel that it is also a very, very powerful image. And I think the only story that can come to mind right away is the story of Bishop Faridi Taban in Sudan, who after the civil, he worked very hard trying to create peace in Sudan, the signing of the peace agreement. After the civil war, he retired as bishop because he wanted to go in a rural area, a very remote area of Kroc, and that is where he founded a peace village called the Holy Trinity Peace Village, where he brought together different tribes that were at war with one another on this land, where they worked together to grow food together, with education, healthcare, a very, very concrete model in the middle of South Sudan, Holy Trinity Peace Village. I think the most provocative aspect of the Peace Village is that he named it the Holy Trinity Peace Village, to show that if you want to think about the Trinity, think about this concretely. This is what it's about. It's about this kind of relationship between the so-called enemy tribes, working together, raising families together, growing food together on the land. I think that's a kind of a very powerful model of thinking about the Trinity in our time, Bishop Farid Taban and the Holy Trinity at Peace Village.
Okay, thanks. We're just about out of time, but Bram has been waiting patiently. Can we just take? Oh, I'm sorry. Bishop, would you like to? Okay.
Sobre la pregunta de la hermana sobre la Trinidad. Sí, San Pablo dice, todas las cosas son de ustedes. Ustedes son de Cristo y Cristo es de Dios. Y ahí está la conexión de la Trinidad. Con Cristo, Dios y hombre. Y de Cristo con nosotros y toda la creación. Tal vez el jesuita Xavieran, aunque no fue muy aceptado por la congregación de la doctrina de la fe, pero tiene elementos muy valiosos tal vez para entender. Pero respecto a las teologías indígenas, el punto de partida es la fe en Jesús de Nazaret, en Cristo, en el Hijo de Dios hecho hombre. Es el punto de partida, porque si ellos rechazan eso, todo lo demás no tiene mucho sentido en las teorías de las comunidades indígenas.
Regarding the Trinity, as St. Paul said, our things are yours, and you are in Christ, and Christ is God's. So there we see the central point. Christ is God made man, Christ with us in creation. We can also look to Taylor de Chardin, perhaps not so accepted in terms of the doctrine or quite controversial, but that there are also many of his thoughts can also apply in this situation. Now, as far as an indigenous theology, it is based and centered completely on Jesus of Nazareth, Christ as the Son of God made man. If that is rejected, then nothing else makes sense.
Lunch awaits. Do we have a short intervention? Go ahead, Bram.
I'll keep it brief. I just wanted to ask Peter maybe to tell a little bit more about why he chose the theories that he presented, because I was rather puzzled by that, I must say. Because I mean, for me, they're sort of you sort of like tried to draw a line through them as though they were kind of compatible, but for me, they're really not. Starting out with the limit to growth, if you look back at that, it's quite different. Particularly, I was wondering why you took up the whole idea by Porrit, capitalism as though the earth matters, because to me we're here in a kind of a conference where, you know, we can sort of like use our imagination to go beyond certain things, and that is exactly sort of a certain colonization of the mind that I find incredibly problematic.
Thanks, Bram. My very first slide showed those four, tried to juxtapose the four in terms of red and green. Red being the ones which are putting a kind of stoplight in front of us, saying we can't go too far. And so the first one was the limits to growth, and the other one was the planetary boundaries, which are both saying slow down, you know, we cannot continue to grow and expand. And then the two greens, which were the Brundtland report and the Porrit thing, are saying continue somewhat to a certain extent business as normal. I've done some work with Brundtland in terms of resource extraction, and Brundtland is saying, or the UN is saying, at least at that stage, 1987, that we will be able to extract more and more as technology improves, as we can sort of get deeper into the earth, etc. So I was sort of juxtaposing red and green, sort of theories that I subscribe to, and I didn't make it clear enough. But I don't agree with Porrit at all myself, and I think Porrit is just way too optimistic, and as you said, capitalism has colonized the mind as though there is no alternative to capitalism. So I wasn't quoting him with 100% approval.
That was my point.
Okay.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to have to